Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome. I'm Chuck Friedman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the LHS Collaboratory, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. Probably some more people will be joining over time. I want to welcome you here today in a presentation in our series on artificial intelligence, and we really have a terrific group of speakers featuring Akbar Waljee, but with Amy Kilborn and Jeffrey Siwo going to offer some comments after Akbar's main presentation. So today's session is being recorded. The slides and recordings will be available on the Collaboratory archive, and as always, we'll have questions and answers at the end of the session. So Akbar will be talking first about Learning Without Borders, AI's dual path in veterans and global health. We'll find out what the dual path is, I guess. And I'll introduce Akbar in more detail in a moment. And then remarks following Akbar's talk will be offered by Jeffrey Siwo, as I said, and Amy Kilborn. So, with no further ado, I will just give you a brief introduction of Akbar. Many of you know him, and we're delighted to have him here with us today, and we're delighted to have Akbar as a member of our Department of Learning Health Sciences, in addition to all of the other things he does. Just read you some brief biography. Akbar is a physician scientist in healthcare policy and innovation, focusing on using machine learning and deep learning techniques to improve healthcare outcomes. He holds several key leadership positions at the university, including serving as faculty lead for IHPI and their Data and Methods Hub, and he's co-director of the Michigan Integrated Center for Health Analytics and Medical Prediction, aka MyChamp, as well as convener for the eHealth and Artificial Intelligence Program, aka eHealth. His educational background includes undergraduate and medical degrees from Emory University, and he also holds a master's degree in health services research from the University of Michigan. He completed a healthcare policy fellowship at the Center for Health and Research Transformation. So, Akbar, I think that establishes your basis for what you're going to be presenting here today, and we're all looking forward to your remarks.
So thank you, everyone, for having me here today. Chuck mentioned sort of my title, Learning Without Borders, AI's Dual Path in Veterans and Global Health. And I have to say, this title somewhat encompasses sort of my career trajectories and the work that I've done over the past several years. And so I'm going to be highlighting some of that work, but more importantly, it's sort of a reflection of where I see the opportunities of data science, and AI as I look back at my career and say, how can we actually utilize AI and data science in the most effective and strategic way? So I'm going to give you some thoughts about that. Know that it's not the only way to think through the use of AI and data science in this way. And I'd encourage you all, even during my talk, to challenge me and help me think about alternative ways, because I really think that the community, especially our DLHS community, has an important role to play in this area. But one of the things that helped me sort of frame my thinking and sort of my approach as I look back at my career is what did COVID teach us, right? And what COVID taught us was the importance of the interdependence that we have globally for each other, and the importance of how data was used to facilitate, in good and bad ways, what happened during COVID. And I want to encourage us that we need to be thinking more globally about this, not only in the context of what is it that we could learn from each other, but what we can learn from those more internationally. And this idea of reciprocal innovation and reciprocal learning, where traditionally we think that innovation sort of comes from high-income countries and goes to low-income countries, and an example of that is sort of the delivery of care that we sometimes do in the United States in this hub-and-spoke model, where we centralize most specialty care, but then deploy, physicians or healthcare providers out rurally, sort of with influx into the hub. But to think about how we could actually learn from the world itself, and this idea of reverse innovation. And an example that's a common example in terms of innovation is sort of, the kangaroo mother of care, right? So in the United States, we typically use incubators for preterm babies or low birth weight babies. But we've also realized that the human body can provide almost the same things that the incubator can, and probably even more effectively, right? In the context of less mortality, reduced infections, and even maintaining of normal temperatures. And COVID actually exemplified how we adopted some of these technologies, or this innovation rather. Cleveland Clinic did that, Hopkins did that, because we didn't want to bring in, babies or keep babies in the hospital during COVID. So this is sort of like, the high-level thinking that I'm going to be using as I exemplify some of the works going forward. And so it's really important to think about this reverse innovation or reciprocal innovation and learning as a thought piece through my presentation. So the outline of this presentation is going to focus on what is artificial intelligence. I like to base that with everybody to make sure we're all talking the same language. Where does generative AI fit within this, within artificial intelligence? And then the opportunities for using AI for health research when resources are limited. Okay, so the whole focus here being reflecting on this career of mine, saying to myself, well, can we use data science, artificial intelligence in a better way, especially when resources are limited? And where's the opportunity there? And some of the opportunities I want to highlight to you around medication optimization, and this is the work that I did within the VA as well as Michigan Medicine. And some of the work that I'm doing more globally now in the context of maternal child health and mental health, and then in cancer or in cancer care delivery. And then again, talk a little bit about using AI to ensure privacy and data security. You can't have a talk about AI not emphasizing that. Now, this is an hour talk in itself, but I'll just exemplify some of those opportunities. And then trust and bias in AI. Borrowing off examples of actually Uwad Steiberg, who was here during our last LHS Collaboratory, but maybe expanding on that just slightly. So let's start off with what artificial intelligence is. It's when a computer does tasks usually done by humans because they require human intelligence and discernment, but really focuses on 3 key skills: learning, reasoning, and self-correction. So when people talk about AI, not all the examples you'll see will do all these 3 things, but there are subsets of AI within that. And so machine learning is an example of that subset that uses statistics to help computers learn from experiences, really understand the patterns that's ongoing with your data. Another way to exemplify this is when you think about traditional programming. It's when you give a computer data, and then you use computer languages like C, C++, Java, to then program and then give you a certain output, a certain outcome. But where artificial intelligence works a little differently is that you give the computer the data and the output, that outcome, and it comes up with the patterns or that program or that algorithm. And that's how I like to think. I'm much more of a visual exemplifying kind of person, so that's how I think through it. But machine learning and artificial intelligence is not magic, right? It really requires the user. The soil could be the data, and this is Peter Dominguez from the University of Michigan that used this as an example. So the soil is the data, the seeds are the algorithms, the plants are the programmers, but you need the gardener, you need the person that's helping develop this algorithm, and it's not done in isolation. Another way to think about artificial intelligence, machine learning, is to think of artificial intelligence as a big bucket, a big circle. Machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence. And then there are various different methodological approaches. And for those that are interested in the methods, I'm highlighting some of these methodological examples because I've actually used them in the works that I've done over the past several years. So support vector machines, random forest is something that you might have all heard about, generative AI, computer vision technologies, reinforcement learning. Again, all examples of methodological approaches within machine learning. And then when you think about generative AI specifically, again, artificial intelligence, generative AI, like you saw in the prior slide, and then within that, there's large language models. The one that's most familiar to everybody is ChatGPT, but there are other examples like Google BERT's example and MedPalms being much more specific to the medical side of things. Okay? So when you're thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and data and how you could actually leverage those sort of technologies and innovations, it's really important to ask the question, what is the question that matters? And I'll show you a potential mistake I made in this, where we didn't talk to the user, the end user, didn't engage the implementation scientists. We were just coming up with a hammer for a solution, but potentially didn't have the right nail that we were working on. So the questions truly, truly matter. The partners that you work with truly, truly matter. And so it's really important to make sure that all the community partners that you want to engage, I'm trying to avoid the word stakeholders, the community partners that you're engaging with are actually part of your team. It's not about just using any method. It's not about wrangling the data in a specific way. You want to make sure that this is generalizable, reproducible, and you're thinking about all the ethical, legal, and social implications. And so the methods really, really matter. And then the teams matter. It's just so important to engage and involve all the communities that could be involved and could help you make that a better project. And in some ways, I want to highlight the Department of Learning Health Sciences because we've got everybody from the programmers to the implementation scientists. We've got that entire pipeline that we could also be doing better at leveraging and involving each other. And so develop that infrastructure, and that pipeline is going to be really important. But what I'm also trying to highlight is all the amazing other potential centers / communities that exist here at the University of Michigan, and this is just a few of them. So when you're thinking about the opportunities of using AI for health research, I'm going to walk you through an example through MyChamp. Chuck mentioned that I co-lead the Michigan Integrated Center for Health Analytics and Medical Prediction, MyChamp. It's a community of folks that sort of discuss healthcare issues that are ongoing, how we could potentially tackle them, where's the most value. Then talk a little bit about my examples in the VA. I spend 50% of my time in the VA. It provides a lot of personal and professional satisfaction, primarily because I feel I can really also make a difference within an integrated health system where you have a finite budget or a finite resources and you're trying to optimize things. And then an example from the Center for Global Health Equity here at the University of Michigan that I wanted to point out to you. So MyChamp is a community of data science methodologists, clinical researchers, statisticians, really trying to leverage the delivery of high-value care, right? Particularly around drug optimization, better outcomes, less side effects, and building this decision support system, not to replace the physician, but to help enable the physician to do better. And so the question is, how can we improve the care from an individual when we've got a lot of data? We've got a lot of health system data. We've got demographic data. We've got EPIC-related data or EHR data. We've got medication data. And when you look at how we can leverage that data using AI, using data science, we can identify patterns that may be able to identify that individual, that precision medicine approach to doing things where you can improve some individual's health, one individual's health, right? And the example I want to give you is something that I treat, which is inflammatory bowel disease or ulcerative colitis. It's a very rare disease in the context of other diseases, but I want to highlight what I want to highlight about inflammatory bowel disease and ulcerative colitis is it's a disease where your body in some ways just attacks your GI tract. Some people will call it an immune-mediated disease or an autoimmune disease, and it affects people in their 20s to 30s. Right? And this is debilitating, where you're presenting with rectal bleeding and diarrhea continuously. Doesn't kill you, it just, a lifelong disorder of morbidity associated with it. And typically, when you're doing a colonoscopy, this is what a normal colonoscopy would look like when you're looking through the colon. And in ulcerative colitis, what is represented there is this inflammation on that left side of your colon, and this is what the endoscopic view or the colonoscopy view of ulcerative colitis. So now you can understand why it's rectal bleeding and diarrhea. You can't absorb any water, and you're just having a lot of diarrhea. And this has a huge impact in the United States. The financial burden of inflammatory bowel disease is between $14.6 to $31.6 billion, and that's mostly medication related. And the current IBD treatment approaches to care still result in persistent symptoms and complications because these drugs are not the best. They work about 60 to 70% of the time. And in fact, when you see these randomized control trials that we use, New England Journal of Medicine, as our gold standard of RCTs, people will say, oh, these drugs work 60 to 70% of the time, but we all know that that's a distribution. Some people will benefit more and some people will benefit less. And trying to identify those that will truly benefit from the drugs is something of quite of interest. Now, when you think about the treatments for ulcerative colitis, they can involve corticosteroids, which is commonly dispensed to people with inflammatory diseases, but these have a lot of side effects associated with it. Then there are other medications called 5-ASA medications, almost like aspirin-like. They're about $2,400 a year, work fairly well, but not in everybody. Then there are these other group of medications called immunosuppressants. So I already told you that this is an autoimmune, immune-mediated disease where your body's revved up and trying to fight your colon. These medications kind of suppress you or rev you down a little bit to prevent you from having these exacerbations of inflammation. These drugs actually cost about $200 a year and are actually quite good. And I've highlighted that in red because that's what I'm going to expand on. Now, the more commonly used drug nowadays, especially with the marketing that you will find around these drugs, are these biologics. So I'm pretty sure all of you have seen on TV Humira, Remicade, Stelara. These are $40,000 a year drugs, right? And remember, I told you that most of this disease affects the 20 to 30-year-olds. So a lifelong use of $40,000 to $60,000 drugs that work maybe 60 to 70% of the time. Okay, so just food for thought there. All these are HIPAA-compliant pictures from DALI-E, but so a 64-year-old male with inflammatory bowel disease doing well on Imuran. How do you make sure we've optimized him, but at the same time made sure that he's not getting side effects? And how could we think through that? Miss J, 23-year-old woman with ulcerative colitis, she reads that prednisone, narcotics, herbal medications, other medications to use. But we know that some of these medications may not work. But how do you individualize treatments? Based on that randomized control trial in the New England Journal of Medicine, we should treat everybody the same and give them all the same drugs, and somehow that will solve their problems. But again, there's a distribution of how people actually will respond to these drugs. And how do you individualize? So going back to these treatments, the focus is really on these immunosuppressant drugs. And what we did was, and this is back in 2009, okay? This is how far back we're going. We developed a machine learning algorithm for objective remission and clinical outcomes using these thiopurine medications. Many inflammatory bowel disease patients are on these drugs, but as marketing has been going on, they're being used less and less. But when we used these drugs, we would monitor people just based on a complete blood count and their chemistries, which are $60 tests. But every specialist would think about it differently. They would look at it and say, oh, your hemoglobin is up, maybe they're bleeding less. That's a good sign. Your white count's a little bit down, meaning you're immunosuppressed a little bit. But there was no consistent way or algorithmic way that we could standardize that and said, could we leverage machine learning to find these patterns that we can then use more reproducibly? There's an alternative. You could get a drug level. And that drug level will cost about $300. It takes about a week to come back. This company, Prometheus, is a billion-dollar company, or even more at this point. And so a lot of people were gravitating to using these drugs as a way to monitor your patients. But when you look at the performance of these drug levels, which is, yeah, I agree, quite intuitive, it had a very low sensitivity, very low specificity, and it didn't predict well how you truly looked in your colon. It maybe told you how the patient's telling you how they felt. And so there could be a bias there, but it didn't objectively tell you how people were doing. And so when you're thinking about that hypothesis, you take these drugs, yes, you can get metabolite levels or these drug levels that tell you how a patient's doing. But what we argued is that these drugs affect your immune system, your blood chemistries in a certain way that's a closer endpoint to the biological response. So can we actually take these labs and try and find out patterns that could say who's doing well and who's not doing well? So the aims of our study back in that time was to use the age and just chemistry values, the $60 test, to try and predict who was in biological remission and who was not. That was in some ways signified by either being immunosuppressed adequately or not. But even more than saying, hey, are they adequately immunosuppressed or not adequately immunosuppressed, are we seeing less steroids, less hospitalization, less surgery? That's the true clinical endpoint. And so we did a retrospective analysis. We used random forest, one of the methodological approaches in machine learning, and we developed algorithms for adequate immunosuppression and inadequate immunosuppression. I won't spend too much time on the cohort itself. Know that this was about 2,000 patients, not an extensive cohort. This was actually just a Michigan medicine population. And We really used stringent criteria in identifying who was truly in biological remission and who wasn't. And this was using every modality possible, colonoscopy, imaging, because we truly wanted to make sure that they were in biological response. And what I want to show you is the performance characteristics. These are not all the performance characteristics. The typical one we look at is the AURC. And as you know, the AURC is 1 minus specificity on the x-axis, sensitivity on the y-axis. And a test that's as good as a coin flip is diagonal. And you can see that the metabolite levels or the drug levels that I told you about before, that billion-dollar company, is no better than a coin flip. Okay? But people use this all the time. But our machine learning algorithm was significantly better. I don't know if you can see that orange color very well, but it was significantly better. And there was this statistical difference between that. What was nice about this is you can actually tell what are the variables that actually went to it and how important they are, and actually do they make sense, right? So the first thing you'll see there is the hemoglobin, right? Less bleeding, they're doing better. It gives you an idea of what those variables are, the features are, and this could also be hypothesis generating. There are things on there that you'll be like, I wonder why the alk-phos is there. But if you look at the literature or you can hypothesize, then you can find some benefits from using these approaches. You remember I said it's more than just the immunosuppression, is it actually leading to better outcomes? So among the smaller cohort of this, less steroid use, less hospitalizations, less surgery, and overall a significant benefit from using this. Now we adopted this into the MyChart and Epic back in 2014, 15, I think when Epic just came out. We made it part of the normal workflow. Physicians could easily go and look at the labs and under the lab value and look at the immunosuppression score right there. It was actually something that I thought, wow, I think I'm going to make a difference here. Okay, but again, in summary, it's inflammatory bowel disease disorder, really focused on thiopurines, and how do we actually can we use machine learning and AI to do better? But here are the challenges. Okay, nobody uses it. Okay. Providers don't relate to the score or percentage. When you put a percentage of 80%, they want to know why it's not 100%. So we added 50 to everything, and so it was above 100%, and then people were like, well, why is it over 100%? Okay? Not engaging the people at the endpoint is going to be a real barrier to adoption. Okay? Yep, fonts, italics, details all matter to providers, and so some of the things that we learned from this. It's unclear if providers and patients are okay with a calculation derived from AI and ML. I'll argue that the creatinine is, nobody argues about that. But clearly, we may not trust AI and machine learning. There's definitely biases and ethical, legal, social implications. When this comes out and makes a wrong decision, who's liable, right? All things that we think about. And then do partners care about optimizing a less expensive medication, right? So if physicians know that the insurance is going to pay for it, who cares, right? So why are we doing this? And then external validation and prospective study is extremely important. So we externally validated this on a clinical trial cohort that was published in New England, and it worked. We've done this in multiple institutions. But finally, 2009 till now, lots of years, I finally found that maybe this is not the right environment. And so we just got funded in the VA to do this in a VA system where, you know what, when you're spending $40,000 on a drug, that means $40,000 less for someone with a traumatic brain injury or someone with an amputation. And so we're hoping to actually validate this and prospectively use this in the VA. So just something to think about. I'm going to pause there for just a second because I know this is, people may have some questions about this as I move on further. Thoughts, questions?
Akbar, do you think there's a learning curve with some of these initiatives?
I think so, and
We may be a little bit more resistant to incorporate new concepts.
Yeah,
To people early enough.
No, yeah, it's the whole idea of diffusion of innovation theory, right? And I can't, human behavior is very hard to understand. Somehow, everybody wants to use ChatGPT because it's the shiny and bright object, but is it the right thing to do? Vinod brought that up recently to me and something to think about. But I don't know what it takes. I think there's part of those are barriers. I think our implementation scientists are really here to help us think through some of these things. And, Amy maybe has a comment or two about that during our panel. But these are all things to think about because I think there are opportunities here, and these may be missed opportunities. But the question is, how can we actually leverage what's needed to make this happen?
Yeah. Akbar, maybe this is under biases, but What about all the advertising campaign for the biologics?
100%,
Yeah.
right? All our fellows and trainees are like, why do I need to follow these labs? We could just give them biologics. There's so much marketing around these drugs. So much marketing around these drugs. Yeah?
Well, I would assume the drug companies have their own studies that show how superior their drugs are. So how's a doctor supposed to know which study is really valid? And
Yeah.
you're saying one thing, they're saying another thing.
That's true. So what's interesting, and inflammatory bowel disease, or GI, is a little bit of a different beast than other diseases. We've no head-to-head trials with these drugs. All the trials that come out are usually placebo to the drug. There's an incentive where drug companies know that they can potentially achieve that 60 to 70% efficacy rate without comparing to placebo. But even with placebo rates, some placebo rates are 30%. Yeah?
So then how does that relate to what the FDA is doing?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. Clearly, that's something, I don't know necessarily how they're thinking, but I think there's being more and more sort of attention being brought to, how do you help with decision making? And, more importantly, there's just a volume of information coming out. And the question is, can we do things in a more reproducible way like this that then can allow you to develop more validation studies to say, hey, now we can show, based on some of these approaches or these newer technologies, where the potential benefit is. Right? And because, again, if you're not optimizing a cheaper drug to its full potential, then you're not also comparing it to the right drug that's on the biological market. Yeah.
I think that part of the challenge that you found an indicator of something, but the clinical actionability piece seems to be missing. So what did you expect clinicians to do with this score? And in a prospective study, what are you going to tell them to do with that score, and how are you going to demonstrate that that actually improves outcomes?
Yeah, yeah. So, all you can do is what you can do with the information that you have at that time retrospectively, with the hope that people then buy into the idea of prospectively doing the study, right? But if you haven't convinced them at even this early stage, I worry that when you're doing a prospective study, without an incentive of why they're doing it, whether they'll see a value in it, which is why going into an integrated healthcare system where they're saying, hey, yeah, we have a limited budget. We need to think of innovative and alternative ways. How would they do that? And when I think about this whole reciprocal learning idea, some of the best technologies and innovation come when your resources are limited, because you've got to find out an alternative. Yeah. So a quick another example from the VA. The VA is well known with chronic disease management. We've got 10 million veterans that have a variety of different disorders. The VA was specifically interested in how to deal with a patient-centered population health program around liver disease, especially hepatitis C, and can we leverage and deliver high-value care when, again, our resources are limited and you're trying to trade off between one place and the other. So, in 2016, there were 250,000 veterans with hepatitis C. In the US, there's 3 million people with hepatitis C. Worldwide, 170 million people with hepatitis C. And what's interesting about hepatitis C was, there was no cure for hepatitis C. People would live with this disease for years and years and years, and their disease would progress from a normal-looking liver to cirrhotic liver to liver cancer. And back in 2015, a new set of drugs, the DAAs, came out, right? This is like 11 to 16 weeks of therapy with a cure rate above 95% with these hepatitis C drugs. That's amazing. We haven't seen one of these in a long, long time. But this came at a price tag, right? It was $100,000 per treatment course. Right, I just said that there are 250,000 veterans with hepatitis C. So how do we manage that? Like, what do we do differently? Like, most people will argue you need to give it to every single veteran. But that would be, what, $25 billion? That would bankrupt the VA just on hepatitis C treatment, right? So we propose this idea that if at a population health level, yes, we know there's hepatitis C, we weren't trying to have an impact on one individual person, but know that there's a huge population that we need to deal with. So one strategy, which may not be palatable to everybody, is to have a triage mechanism and say, who are the people that are likely to progress to cirrhosis faster? Let's treat them first. Well, the cost of these drugs gets cheaper. Let's give them to people that are high-risk behavior that may be passing the disease on. Let's do that. And remember, when people come in for care, there's also already a triage mechanism there. They're seeking care, they will get care. So you're not identifying those people that may need it the most. Here we leveraged actually machine learning algorithms using longitudinal data. right? So we looked at longitudinal data on these parameters and then say, can we predict 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years from now who's going to actually have progression of their liver disease, and let's treat them first. And our performance characteristics were excellent. Now, the VA did a great job using something similar, but a FIB4 sort of calculation to treat a lot of the veterans and most of the veterans. But this is just an exemplification of how you could be doing things and how these potential methodological approaches might work. And why use these potential approaches? Well, there's a population-based approach and there's a precision health approach. The population is at a population level. Whoever comes in, you treat them. A precision health is more at the patient level. It's an untargeted approach versus a more targeted approach. At a population level, you don't really need that granular data. But at the patient level, you really need much more granular data. So then you have to think about the infrastructure. So there are cost implications to this, and maybe that's another reason why this hasn't been universally adopted. But and then you have to prove to them that it's an economically, viable strategy. Are we, with the infrastructure development that we're doing, is that bearing the cost of what you would do just if you had to do it at the population level? So all things to think about. But again, the potential value of using some of these algorithms, AI, in the context of low resources. I will do another pause here before I go to the global health setting. Any other questions? Any other thoughts about sort of my thinking, my approaches? Yeah.
Because we've got some of our infrastructure murders here.
Yeah.
What kinds of infrastructure do you think are required?
Yeah, so it depends on the setting, right? I think part of this is having the data, right? Having ability to access that data. There's a lot of cleaning that needs to be done. There's a lot of standardization that needs to be done. There's a lot of metadata that needs to be done. There's quite a bit of infrastructure. But more important than just the infrastructure, remember, we're thinking about along the pipeline, right? We want to be really thoughtful of saying, hey, when we should be engaging our implementation scientists early on in the process, not later on in the process, making sure we're asking the right questions. If you build something like this and nobody uses it, what a waste of the infrastructure and the resources. Yeah.
So that example you gave about analyzing veterans for their risk of progression.
Yeah.
It seems to me that veterans advocates could say you're using AI to delay treatment using an algorithm that's not precise. So you're going to have 10% of those people are going to progress despite your algorithm in a country that's the richest in the world. So how would you counter arguments like that?
Yeah, so we actually had a merit funded through the VA where we were being very thoughtful and to make sure that whatever strategy we were using was acceptable to the community. So we actually engaged veterans with some faculty in DLHS, Ray DeVries, for example, to do a deliberative democracy session where we actually brought veterans as a community together and say, imagine you were in the legislature, imagine you were in DC making these decisions. How would you make this decision? What would you do differently? And in fact, so unanimously they said, if you have the money, you need to spend it and you need to give the care to all the veterans. But if you don't, it's not unreasonable to use a methodological approach like this. Right? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
This even relates to your discussion of biologics. From a public policy standpoint, is there no incentive to set caps, even if it involves government subsidies for postmortem very expensive benefits?
Right now, I haven't seen any sort of thresholds and saying, like, so for example, in Taiwan, right? Like, they can't afford these drugs. So they'll use it for 1 year, and then they'll stop. Right? So yes, we are one of the richest countries in the world, and we have the resources. I just think we should be a little bit more efficient in utilization of those resources. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And the question is, can some of these technologies help? Yeah.
Akbar, the algorithm you talked about is giving it to the patients most likely to progress, rather than saying some sort of way of saying the patients that will contribute most to society. And I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that's
No,
not
yeah.
That's not, so it's kind of interesting because I wonder if people would argue for that. I mean, you're talking about giving it to perhaps the sickest patients, and some people might say give it to the younger patients because people that aren't as sick, it'll be effective and prevent greater disease, and they'll be healthier and contribute more to society.
Yeah.
Any kind of pushback on that?
I think it also depends on the condition, right? So with, cirrhosis, for example, it takes years and years, maybe even decades to progress to cirrhosis, right? And so, if you can get those that potentially may progress, like, the liver is a fairly resilient organ. They could perform in society very well if they were just cured and treated of some of these complications. Yeah. So I'm going to jump over to the global health setting a little bit here. Again, advocating why technology should be used more broadly and some of the learned lessons that we can learn from sort of our global partners. For example, in Kenya, they, sort of jumped from using home phones and mobile banking to something called M-Pesa, which means mobile money. M-Pesa is used every day for digital transactions. I see some people nodding, so you must have some experience with M-Pesa. I was born in Kenya. I use this all the time. How can we use data in better ways, right? Similarly, when we adopt technologies like AI and machine learning, I think there's an opportunity here to use the state-of-the-art analytics and emerging technologies to rapidly advance care options in some of these environments. And the question is, how do you do that? In 2019, the Center of Global Health Equity engaged in a relationship with Aga Khan University. I think some of you may have seen some of the news articles that came out recently where some of the delegation from AKU came here. But really the goal was here is, can AKU and the University of Michigan strive to improve the health and well-being of our global community while leveraging data science initiatives? To create a collaborative two-way learning environment. This is a dual learning pathway. This is not us trying to emphasize what we think is important. And can we actually, make this a sustainable platform? And in fact, when we developed sort of this collaboration, it was somewhat just preceded strategically, I might say, around this NIH initiative. There was a $100 million initiative around harnessing data science for health discovery and innovation in Africa. And through this program, they were hoping to fund 6 to 7 research hubs, 4 to 5 data science training programs, 4 to 5 ethical, legal, social implication sites, and then a coordinating center. They were very thoughtful of trying to really think about everything from training to actually the research. So we decided to apply for one of these grants as a research hub grant. It was about a $6.5 million grant, the first NIH grant that I wrote. I didn't think I was going to get it. But with the partnership that we developed, Amina Abubakar, who's the contact PI, someone that I've learned so much from and who's just been a force for this movement, we applied for this grant called Utilizing Health Information for Meaningful Impact in East Africa Through Data Science. Uzima DS. Uzima, the sign for well-being, will not take credit for that name. Eileen, who's sitting back there, who's our program manager, who's always embarrassed that I call on her, came up with that title. And the whole goal here is, how do we acquire data in different ways? Now, we're spoiled and we have the luxury of having EHR data, which remind everybody that's built for billing, not for health conditions, right? But can we use social determinants of health or other sorts of kind of data and leverage climate, environment, and other things that could help us better use AI and machine learning methods in order to develop, patterns and risk stratification, and then really deploy that in an open source way for the community to use. And in this case, we wanted to make sure that we did this in a cycle where we're being informed by the community so that we're building something that the community would need to make sure that we actually make sure that this is going to be sustainable and we can disseminate for true impact. The structure of this was that we provided core services, so the dissemination and sustainability core with all our partners and community partners, the Ministry of Health. We had the data and methods core, leveraging new methodological approaches, and an administrative core, which is self-explanatory in terms of grants management. And in the middle, we were agnostic to the diseases, right? But our partner said, what's really important to us is maternal child health and mental health. And so that's where the focus has been. Now, like all grants, you propose all these things that you're going to do that's amazing, that at the end of 5 years you'll see the fruition of. But sometimes we forget all the things in between that have made this a really exciting project on a way and a pathway to helping the community at large. So one of the things that this research hub has done was not only facilitate the research itself, but help build capacity or strengthen the capacity that exists. And so we've had, and fortunate enough to have our global partners come and visit in terms of presidential scholars, learn so much about how you actually deploy a cloud-based environment in a low resource setting. Cloud-based structures are not cheap, but are a sustainable way for thinking through things instead of trying to update your hardware every few years. We have monthly trainee meetings. We have a journalism course. One of the things is, how do you get information out in a way that's understandable? So these data journalism courses is where we actually bring journalists to us and help them tell us how we can convey our information better. And then, so a whole bunch of NIH programs. And I feel lucky to have learned from all our learners. We've got, Faith here, we got, Angela, Rachel, all these amazing people, trainees that we've learned from, that are part of this community that, that I think we can have a huge impact in. And when you look at sort of what we've done as a research hub in the last 3 years, initially, we had a bunch of, few collaborations. On the left side here, you will see those that were engaged in the DSI collaboration, so all those ethical, legal, social implications, the data science training programs. We had a few connections with them, but we had also external collaborators, right, including the Ministry of Health, the business school here, things like that. But in the last 3 years, it's just our network has just dominated. Again, not necessarily something that was explicit that we had to do in the NIH grant, but just shows the power of being a more global community and engaging in work together. And one of the things that came out of this was the sort of colorectal cancer grant that I'll briefly talk to you about next, which is something that's obviously dear to me as a gastroenterologist. We published a paper, which I can share with all of you in gut, about potential opportunities and challenges of using AI in sort of the colon cancer screening sort of domain, but note that this could be applied to almost any cancers. One thing that's important to realize about colon cancer is that in the United States, above age 45, the risk of colon cancer is about 3 to 5%. And we typically, traditionally, screen people using colonoscopies because they're the definitive treatment pathway if you see a polyp. Unfortunately, there's only one colonoscopy per 100,000 people in Africa, so you can't do that. We also know that by 2050, 50% of Africans who are going to be there's going to be those that are 20 to 30-year-olds, 50% of them are going to be existing in Africa. But 2 out of every 5 new births by 2050 are going to be in Africa. So how are we going to manage this? And we'd be short-sighted to not think that there's not immigration happening and things like that. How are we going to be screening for a population that's at risk of colon cancer? So there's many approaches to potentially using AI in this space, especially because right now people are, really presenting at stage 4. And I think all of you might have known that, for example, the Black Panther actor, he died in his 30s with stage 4 colon cancer, right? So how can we do better in the cancer care pathway? And so one approach is to, can we use random forest approaches like what I just told you about leveraging labs? Labs are universal, they're very objective, they exist all over the world, they're much cheaper. And can we use, some ways to leverage the labs in a way that says, okay, who's high risk? And can we take these blood samples, even these blood spots, and try and leverage that to actually then decide who's at high risk and who's not? We don't know why this is happening among the 20 to 30-year-olds. Is it that they're just living past infectious diseases? Is it more genetic and environmental contributions? But nevertheless, we have to deal with this, and we have to figure out how to do this. There are other ways to use AI technologies in the cancer space. Generative AI is being used as a way to augment for image enhancement. We use this in the United States already. For the good, for the bad, it'll give you a bounding box about where these dysplastic lesions are that you can remove. Now, if you're not looking there, then it's not going to show it to you. So you're not taking out the operator. And in some cases, people are suggesting that this make gastroenterologists a little lazier at doing their work because they're assuming that this is going to show them what the problem is. But this could also be used as a training modality for people in low-resource countries that need, education and promotion in how to do these colonoscopies. And then there's this entire place about using computer vision in the pathological diagnosis. So this is a grant we just got funded for. The traditional way of looking at pathology specimens is that you get a whole slide with pathology. You get a courier to take these glass slides to the pathologist who then reads it. You get a diagnosis, and then you can help dictate treatment pathways. And what we're proposing is an alternative way, which is you get the histological slide. You can actually use an iPhone with a microscope just to take a digital representation of that histology. Instead of ordering millions of dollars of reagents to stain these slides, you can do computer vision digital masks on these slides to help you with automation of this in a way that can help promote, colon cancer, detection, prognosis, and diagnosis, especially when those resources of pathologists are limited in those settings. So this is how it would work. Imagine slide A is that of a colon cancer. You would have a mask in panel B that would show you the globules and the potential cancers. Panel C is all the interstitium, all the stuff in between those globules. And then when you subtract B from C, you get D, which is the cancer. This is all done through masking. This is all done through automation. And then the pathologist more iteratively can look at this, maybe even faster, may be able to help you better understand the diagnosis and prognosis. But this couldn't have been done without a team, right? A team of pathologists locally, a rural hospital, 10-week hospital is a faith-based hospital where we'll be getting samples from. But this entire community of partners that are integral and essential to make this research a success. So this is just a quick demonstration of some of the other continued work that we're doing, sort of in the global setting that has potential implications. If we can show standard of proof of practice there, then we could bring that technology back here and say, why aren't we doing this in this way too? So maybe opportunities both way. So a big shift here, but just a short amount of time on this. Using AI to ensure privacy and data, we've got some of the most amazing people here. We know there's the person that does a lot of this in terms of de-identification of medical records, de-identification of GPS. So when I'm saying, well, there's a lot of different kinds of data we can get in low middle income countries, but it is based on site and GPS location. How do you mask those? There's definitely AI techniques, like random noise injection and perturbation. To do that, and when it comes to medical record notes, which EHR is not universally deployed in Africa, but we know and have these techniques of de-identification of notes. There's another approach around federated learning. There's still a big concern about sharing of data between countries, across countries, and where AI could be potentially useful is you build algorithms in individual communities, individual countries, and share the algorithm, not the patient data. And that's another approach around federated learning, which is extremely important to think through. When you're thinking about trust and bias in AI, again, it's extremely important to think through that. I'm going to give you a quick example, which I don't know if it's the perfect example, and I'm sure Jeffrey is going to have a comment or two about this. So this is Jeffrey's study, who's here. Jeffrey, I don't know, Jeffrey, is it this week that we just got the announcement that you got this funded? So congratulations. So this is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grant. It's around using demographic surveillance data to develop causal associations. So most people will argue observational data, maybe you can do causal associations, but this is a strategy of us thinking through that. I see some wincing going on there. We can talk about it. And then, the potential use of large language models. And the goal here is, we have these big demographic surveillance sites in Africa. Can you use this DSS data to identify patterns that could then can potentially develop causal inference that could augment large language models with some truth? Because right now, I'm not sure we trust ChatGPT, and I think you saw that from the last talk, and for those that haven't, I have a demonstration about that. And then how can you get this messaging to sort of the policymakers, the community, the first-line providers? So I don't know if some of you were at Iwat's talk last month, but he gave this example, which I felt obligated to try, right? So what he said was, ChatGPT is really polite, it's really good at guessing, it's really good at translating information, but is it accurate, right? And so in this case, and I did the same thing he did, which was, can you help me with the calculation? It said, of course, please, we're happy to help you with a calculation. You give it a 5-digit random number and ask it for the product, and it gives you an answer, and it's the wrong answer, right? And then you tell it it's the wrong answer, and it says, I apologize, I'm going to do it again, and it gives you an answer, still the wrong answer, right? And then you tell it again, are you sure? And this time it's positively convinced that it's the right answer, and it's still the wrong answer, right? So when you're trying to think about trust, now, in all fairness and all credit, this is a large language model. This is not what it was built on. You had to think about the training of the data. But it's important to reflect on this. Now, I feel like I had to do this again, right? So a week ago, I did this again. And guess what? Now it's built a Python script in ChatGPT to do this. But remember, it's not put a calculator in there. It's not made a training data set to actually develop a large language model that can actually do this work, right? So this is the Python script that's now built into ChatGPT. Yeah. So how I thought I could use this, and again, Jeffrey will tell you this is a terrible example, but I'm going to give you this example anyway. But this is what I imagined that would happen if you had a demographic surveillance site and you were trying to leverage sort of causal inference here, and you were trying to use ChatGPT plus truth. And I'm asking it, and this is really, really small, but essentially I'm saying, what is the risk of low birth weight in sub-Saharan Africa if you were to get malaria? And it gives me this wide range of 5 to 23% of the likelihood of having low birth weight if you got malaria. But now you're going to give it some truth. You're going to say, based on a WHO record, we know that 900,000 low-term birth weights out of 11 million pregnancies. It does the calculation right, gives you 8.81%. Now I'm asking, can you translate it in a way that other policymakers, innovation, first-line providers could use this information? And it tells you 8 out of 100 people are at risk. So there is some value here. The question is, how do we get the most value out of this? How do we actually incorporate things that actually have ground truth to make this a more useful product? But also at the same time, think about the trust and biases associated with all of this. These are DALL-E images where I say to DALL-E, tell me what it looks like when AI is taking care of a patient, and with all its biases, it draws a cartoon picture. And then, what is it that it takes a human to take care of a human? And a really nice picture here about what's lacking traditionally in AI, which is empathy and a lot of other things. You can't actually take away the human from care, and this is really important to reflect on. Yeah. Things that you may already know, every technology, has its biases. The pulse ox, as you know, was sort of the standard query to screen people during COVID, right? And if you had a pulse oxygenation less than 90%, you would supplement with oxygen, right? But what we showed at the University of Michigan, that having a darker skin or black patients were being under-detected for the need for oxygen, right? And in the ICU, I think it was like 11% miscalibration versus 3 to 5%. This led to a New England Journal of Medicine article that showed about the racial bias associated with pulse ox. So as new technologies come out or new appliances come out, we really got to think through all these. And the FDA, and the Senate had to revise their thinking around how these new sort of devices, new algorithms, AI things are going to be coming in. I think you heard all about that in the sort of the new updated WHO, Midas event that happened recently. So I think I'm on time here. So in summary, artificial intelligence and generative AI have a potential of improving care when resources are limited. That's potentially one domain that I think we could use this and potentially use this now. There are opportunities to do this in a lot of spaces, including medication optimization, around other things going on around the world, including cancer care pathways. AI can be used to ensure privacy and data security, but don't forget the trust and biases associated with this. So thank you.
Do that to me, you bastard. So let me introduce our two discussants, Jeffrey Siwo, whose research integrates fundamental biology with computational approaches such as AI and systems biology to drive equitable advances in drug discovery and clinical medicine. He previously was a research assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame and a research scientist at IBM Research Africa and the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center. He served as founder of several technology companies, including Anza Biotechnologies and Helix Nanotechnologies, and as an advisor to the Saguaro Capital Management and Immunisoft Corporation. Financial manager. How to talk to you. Okay, Amy, our other discussant, Amy Kilborn, acting director of the VA Health Services Research and Development Program, director of the VA Quality Enhancement Research Initiative, also known as QUERY, and professor of learning health sciences here at the University of Michigan. With over 45 centers across the U.S., the mission of QUERY is to improve veteran health by accelerating the implementation of research findings into real-world policy and practice. Dr. Kilborn's research goal is to improve population health by testing implementation strategies, that word that Akbar mentioned so many times, to facilitate the spread of effective practices in real-world treatment settings. She developed the Enhanced Replicating Effective Programs, EREP framework, and conducted the first national sequential multiple assignment randomized trial, SMART, to assess the added value of more versus less intensive implementation strategies. So I don't know which of you is going to speak first. but whichever one of you is going to speak first, take it away.
Well, thank you, Chuck, for the introduction, and thank you, Akbar. So I think one of the things that really fascinates me about AI and the future is that, over the past 10 or so years, we've seen tremendous advancements in big data. And as we know, data in itself is very limited, right? Because data only captures a portion of the real world. We know, even as we see that generative AI has made incredible advances over the past few years, generative AI is not constrained, but what we observe in real data. And I think this is a huge danger as we use generative AI, especially in healthcare, because in healthcare, there's a lot of constraints within the healthcare system or within the human body, and these constraints are not available in data. So my interest is in integrating knowledge into data-driven AI systems because data in itself has fundamental limitations, and mostly in the world, the data we have is observational data, right? So even when you do a clinical trial, which can be a randomized control trial, and you know what the interventions are, so ideally you should be able to dig out what is causing what in the clinical trial. Are the patients getting better because of this treatment, or are the patients getting better because of placebo effect or because of something else? Ideally, you should be able to get that from a clinical trial. But in reality, no, because even a clinical trial is still in many ways observational. So this is why we are proposing that the way to apply AI in observational data is also to bring the ideas of causal inference. So how can we use observational data to understand the underlying causes in that data? And there are two ways to do that. So we can use a data-driven approach where we try to use those observations and use counterfactual reasoning and other kinds of approaches to get to the causes in the data. But we're also interested in leveraging large language models. So I think one of the powerful things about large language models is that they allow you to reason over language. So when I see ChatGPT, I think ChatGPT is good at reasoning over language. It might have been trained on biased data, but broadly we can say that ChatGPT can give you reasonable answers. Those answers may not be factually correct in some cases, but they sound grammatically correct. So we are trying to develop new ways of taking advantage of large language models to reason over causal diagrams that have been generated from observational data. So we use observational data, then from that data, we can draw a causal diagram of what causes what, and then we can use a large language model to reason over that causal diagram. And we've done some small sets of experimentation that shows that actually we could also use large language models to generate causal diagrams. So for instance, the large language model can be used to come up with not completely accurate causal model, but at least a starting point. And our goal is to combine the data-driven causal diagrams with the large language-driven causal diagrams. So we are saying that neither approach is good on its own, but can we combine these two approaches so that they can perform better? And I think that also gets to the questions of the issue of biases. When you use observational data and we find that, for instance, there's a correlation between race and an outcome, obviously we should be careful about that because your race does not make you to do something, right? And so I think by using these causal models, we can actually address some of these issues to do with trust and bias. So yeah, thank you, and I think we'll have discussion afterwards, and
Yes.
I'll let Amy speak next.
Sure. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for setting the stage. And Akbar, that was a wonderful presentation. I don't know how you, if you have any time to sleep, since you have a foot in both, in actually all sorts of worlds, VA, global, and so forth. But I'll maybe give a couple reflections of maybe where the future of informatics and implementation science is going, especially with some of the a lot of the innovation work coming out of this department and your work in artificial intelligence. So, you know, as Chuck mentioned, one of my passions is the design and testing of what's called implementation strategies. And so implementation strategies, what are they? They're essentially the things you do to help providers and others do the right thing in real world practice. These are basically tools or methods that help frontline providers implement the thing that you want them to do, and in order to improve the uptake of the effective innovation or intervention, and ultimately to improve patient outcomes. And a lot of implementation science is about the development and testing of these different strategies that are often given to providers or systems to basically improve the uptake of effective innovations and so forth. And I would say there's two types of implementation strategies, and I think we touched upon both of them here. One are what I would call transactional focused strategies. These are basically things like performance incentives or things that help frontline providers do essentially better care or do better quality of care. But the other side of the coin are these transformational focused strategies. These are basically what motivates and inspires frontline providers to do the right thing. And you really need both together in order to really move, again, that over the diffusion of innovation to get more frontline providers to adopt something. And you talked about this in the fact that what you needed, I think, thinking back and having that hindsight, was basically a combination of transformational and transactional strategies. So one example of a transformational strategy might be user-centered design or deliberative democracy or community working groups. These are when you get input from the end users of something and have them take ownership in the thing that you're trying to implement. So imagine having a situation where you could get frontline provider input on a new AI tool. So let's say, for example, you're designing a study and you want to use ChatGPT or AI to basically generate automated patient letters and then basically save the provider time and essentially time and stress in terms of trying to generate all the paperwork. So that would be a great idea on paper, right? Well, you really need to get that frontline provider input and also end users as well, the people receiving those letters, like patients, to make sure that what you're doing is actually making sense. Another example of a transformational focused strategy is something where you have that human factor. And a human factor is basically someone such as a quality improvement expert, someone who's had lived experience in a condition, someone who's survived colorectal cancer, for example, actually help facilitate and work with frontline providers to actually help them maybe adopt a new evidence-based practice for that condition or treatment. And a facilitator is based on a lot of the literature showing that when you have someone who can help frontline providers do the right thing, they're more likely to use, essentially, improve the uptake of the effective innovation or intervention. But what we found also is that you cannot do too much all at once to frontline providers. They're very busy and they're often very stressed out, and we have a lot of issues these days, especially with the onset of COVID and post-pandemic issues around provider burnout. And so not surprisingly, a lot of the work that we've done on testing different implementation strategies basically has found that more implementation support is not necessarily better. And you really have to pace what you're giving in terms of support to frontline providers and to ask them to change and innovate yet again and again. So I would say another innovation or opportunity in the field of both informatics and implementation science is really using essentially different types of study designs, such as the sequential multiple assignment randomized design, or more simply an adaptive design. And what is an adaptive design is basically when you have a situation where you are rolling out, let's say, a new innovation such as a new predictive model. And let's say you want to use this predictive model to improve quality of care for colorectal cancer screening. And let's say that maybe you roll this out to 100 different hospitals or 100 different sites, and maybe about, I would say, 80 of those hospitals or sites are just not using a new model to help with improvement of care. You focus on those 80 sites and then basically do that implementation strategy study based on those sites. Let the early adopters do what they're doing and learn from them. But basically what an adaptive trial does is more efficiently use limited resources that you have to provide implementation support to those sites. So I think by design and methods, there's a lot of innovation we can have going on when it comes to both informatics and AI and also with implementation science. I would say a final few things and some thoughts in terms of the role of implementation science, which is, I think one factor is we really need to pay attention to the quality of the data being generated. So I love working in a VA because you have expansive and very comprehensive medical record data. It's wonderful. Trying to do the same types of interventions when we've done implementation trials in, let's say, community mental health outpatient sites in Michigan, very different story. Even in this country, we have places that don't have the same quality of data that you get in a hospital system or places like that. We've had to literally build our own and jerry-rig our own electronic health record type data when we've done work in community mental health and when we've tried to work with people with serious mental illness, for example. So that's number one. And I imagine in a lot of LMICs, you're also dealing with that problem as well. We've used innovations such as the use of smartphones to basically collect information from students and teachers when we've done a stool-based study, when we tried to implement cognitive behavioral therapy for students, which, by the way, stools don't have EHRs like they do in hospitals, just as, as a point. I think another thing to think about, too, is the importance of community engagement and the science of engagement. And this is where I think we have a lot of innovation in this department and beyond, where we can really tap into the idea of getting patients involved and getting frontline providers involved and a community involved and using the science of engagement to actually really move the needle on both the uptake of effective innovations, of the empowerment of these communities, and also just the science itself. And so I think in the future, there is going to be a lot of really interesting opportunities in the application of implementation science thinking, of artificial intelligence, and also qualitative analysis. I'm thinking of conversational analysis and the stuff that FW is working on, and also data standardization, like Rachel, what you're working on, and others. And so I think there's ample opportunity to maybe explore ways in which these methods could also be combined with other methodologies to really move the needle forward and push the science forward. So those are just some thoughts and musings, and again, thank you so much for your lecture. Yeah.
Thank you all. Those are wonderful comments and wonderful lecture, Akbar. A follow-up question to you. So I was very interested in the initiative in Africa and the target audiences, maternal health, and then youth with mental health disorders. Is that an example of how those two focus groups were arrived at, of deliberative democracy at the local level? Or how did that happen? And then the second part of the question is, are there some innovative approaches that are going to be used in terms of addressing the mental health issues, rather than maybe what we would use conventionally in a more pharmaceutically driven approach in the United States?
Yeah, no, thank you, John, for that question. I'll have to maybe even ask our team, Eileen, but I think most of the question and topics that came from our partners, but they're very engaged in the community themselves. So I don't know if they didn't use a necessarily deliberative democracy approach. Mental health is still a bit of a taboo in Africa, but I think they were recognizing more and more of those needs as people part of the community, but also investigators as part of the study that help us drive those two topics. In terms of the innovative approaches around how to deliver care, especially in the more rural setting, there's definitely new and innovative ways. I think interesting is just awareness is important. And we found out from our team members that just having radio shows, which is the traditional mechanism now still of communicating with the population, they reached 500,000 people in the community during their first radio show. And then this past week, Amina just mentioned that they reached 800,000 people. So part of this is awareness. Then it's the adoption. Now, mobile technology penetration is really, really high in low-middle-income countries across the globe. And so there are folks like John Pate here, in our VA, that's used CBD therapy through mobile phones to deliver the messaging at rural communities that could apply here in the United States too. So there's definitely different modalities to do this. And I hate to say this, but the bar is also different, right? Like the reality is there is no alternative. So anything that could potentially help promote just understanding and potentially may benefit is something rather than nothing. And so I think we just have to study those more in those settings.
Hi, thank you all for your remarks. Jeffrey, I'm Rachel Richardson. Good to see you in real life.
Yeah, nice to see you.
I'm also really excited about the potential of using the existing data that we have to solve problems and identify which treatments work best under different conditions. And I'm also intrigued but very naive about causal inference. But I did read Judea's Pearl's book a few years ago and thought, we're ready. We've got the EHRs, we've got the data, we're ready. But then I keep coming up against all these limitations with the observational data, right? Just all the fact that it's just incomplete, different levels of quality. You never know if you're seeing everything. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on where we're going with that, or how causal inference could sort of overcome those limitations in observational data. And then for Akbar and Amy as well, just what do you think our readiness is to do this comparative effectiveness stuff anytime soon?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for that question. So I think in terms of the feasibility of causal inference, I think there's very good precedents there. And so Judea Pearl, in his book, The Book of Why, has, even just from like a non-mathematical way, like explaining several reasons why causal inference can work, right, from observational data. So I don't think there's doubt about that. I think, though, that you always need some external knowledge, right? You cannot rely on data alone. So, for instance, in the biological field, where my foundation is in the biological field, and I like to think about all of these problems from that biological lens. And when I do that, I constrain what I see in data based on what I know about the mechanisms, say, of disease, right? So just because I saw something in data doesn't make me believe it. I have to have another reason that is not based on the data. So unfortunately, for most data sets, we don't have like physical laws, right? So in physics, we can say that we know what the laws of motion are, we know what the laws of light are, we know the law of gravity. And using these foundational laws, we can constrain what we observe in data. DALL-E today, the image generator, generates images without thinking about the physics of light, right? And that's why when you generate like an image with let's say DALL-E, even though it looks like realistic, if you do that for several images, like in a complex scenario, you'll actually find that it's making very awkward mistakes that don't make sense at all. So I think we need to find some ways of bringing in domain expertise, even when we apply causal inference into observational data. And maybe I'll let Akbar add.
Yeah. So I guess the question was sort of the effectiveness of some of these interventions. And, sort of the pipeline that I think about is that, when you're developing a prediction model, and I think others have said this before, is that, you're looking at the performance characteristics of that model. But at some point, that model then becomes a decision aid or a product that then has to then face normal sort of like usual care pathways. This is where I think the research is evolving, is that, what are the regulations that are going to be emerging around the product itself and the FDA regulations, because it's not the algorithm itself anymore, it's now a product. And the product that's going to be going through the cost effectiveness is the product versus usual care. And so I think that's going to be sort of a domain that's opening up, where they're going to be expecting that it's not my algorithm they're testing, but it's actually the decision support tool with the engagement of a provider plus usual care that you're going to try to pilot. And remember, because there's also that user person in there, and then there's liability associated with it, we're going to have to evaluate those strategies. But I think that thinking is coming out.
Yes, this may be a little bit off topic, but I haven't seen a lot of discussion of how AI may be used to develop prevention strategies. Is that due to lack of objective data, or are there incentives against it? I guess you did mention a little bit with the environmental factors, incorporating that into some of the models, but could you comment on that just a little bit?
An example of environmental factors?
Do you mean what kind of, like prevention, like disease prevention, or just prevention of bad outcomes, or both?
Disease prevention.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example. So, I mean, there's a lot of interest now in looking at climate and environment as potential triggers for preventative strategies. And I think that's going to be a huge domain to think through. I don't know if this completely answers your question, but, there have been some instances where in low-middle income countries, a roof could be either a tin roof or a clay roof. And a tin roof can, even though more durable, can retain more heat, leading to poor maternal and child outcomes. Whereas a clay roof, maybe not as durable, but maybe isn't that much of a heat sink. Or you paint something more of a white nature as a reflective lens. So that's a preventative strategy in some way that could be only found through the information from climate and environment and potentially birth outcomes. So those are maybe the only example I'm thinking of right off the top of my head right now. But there's definitely, the key here is preventative strategies, and that's probably where we can make the biggest mark. But again, there's the whole pipeline, right? Because once you present, we got to figure out how to take care of them too.
I wanted to address that
Yeah.
a bit in terms of sort of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and obesity. There is a significant amount of work being done in those areas of prevention, and whether that's through the new classes of drugs that are out, or whether that's using AI for physical activity types of recommendations, for nutrition, all of those types of things that factor into how we prevent obesity and diabetes.
I'll just add really quick as well, in the VA, there's been a growing amount of interest and work on using AI and machine learning to prevent adverse outcomes such as suicide among veterans, which, actually went up for the first time this year. It was going down for the last couple of years and then went up, unfortunately, as well as homelessness, which is another big issue that we're dealing with among veteran populations. And I think one of the big things that we've learned, though, is it takes more than the actual predictive model to do something about it. So it's often always coupled with a program in which there's outreach to the veterans based on the initial findings of the model that basically tell you if a veteran's more or less at risk, and then it's a way of being able to follow up in a more efficient way to veterans.
Amy, you brought up the effects of disruption in the workplace when you're trying to implement changes. And for example, with pathologists, if your job is threatened because AI is going to be reading all your slides, you're going to tend to be opposed to that kind of progression. And I was talking to a med student recently who's going into radiology, and she has to think about which area of radiology she's going to go into, because she'd like to know she's going to have a job in 10 years. So I'm just wondering, how do we address the resistance to change and the threats to future jobs when you're implementing AI?
That's an excellent question. Well, if anything, I'll say if you're a physician and you're looking for a job, the VA is hiring and needs to hire more physicians, so we'll take them. But that's number one. So actually, we do have a labor shortage in VA at least. But now, getting back to your point about technology and disruptive and change and things like that, my sense is I think it depends on the situation, but this is where you really need that end user input and to get frontline providers to basically be a part of not only in designing this new innovation, but basically maximizing its value. I do not think, and I don't think anyone on this panel thinks that an AI machine alone will basically replace people. We still need people to do things. This was actually a very poignant point that was made in the recent discussions around the VA, and I'll just mention VA because that's why I live and breathe all the time. So the VA is going through a massive modernization of its electronic health record. It had a legacy software system that I think a lot of people were, if you talked to them 10 years ago, were complaining about it. It crashed all the time and things like that. And suddenly when they were told that they needed to change it to a commercial off the shelf, suddenly the old clunky system became the ideal, and this new system was a threat to their way of doing medicine, and in part because it was calculating much more precisely workload, okay? But one of the things that came out of that discussion that was very interesting was the fact that there were issues about the EHR that actually had more to do with the fact that it was more of providers not following up with patients, especially those with suicidal ideation, for example, rather than the mistake that the machine made. So we can never, ever replace everything with just machines and artificial intelligence. It has to be coupled with the human factor. Humans have to be part of that, isn't it? It's really meant to be an extension of human-driven medicine. It cannot be a replacement. And hopefully that's the case in other ways. So.
We're at the end of our time. So thank you very much, panel.
Thank you, everybody. This is awesome. Thanks so much.